What exactly was captured on camera in Wyoming? While the Pentagon officially denied investigating UFOs for years, everything changed after a chilling encounter in Wyoming. What happened that night forced authorities to confront something they had long tried to dismiss. On a quiet Friday afternoon in October 1974, a Wyoming oil driller walked into the woods to shoot an elk and came out 2 hours later, unable to remember his own name.
Went to pick up my crew to go to work, and one of them was sick, so we couldn't work. So I came back to the house and decided I'd go hunting. So I decided to go on down into the forest, and I hunted down there until, it must have been around 4 o'clock. So I walked down over this hill. Whenever I got over the hill, I seen these 5 elk standing down there. One of them was a big bull, so I raised my gun to shoot.
Carl Higdon says he was pulled aboard a transparent craft, examined, and then set back down on Earth so disoriented he couldn't tell searchers where he was or who he was.
Oh. Can't get in, there ain't no door.
Do you know how you get in?
No. We're above the trees. I can see pretty good. The ball looks like a basketball, but it's got a blue gray outline. It's kind of dark. No lights. There's the lights again.
What makes his story stand apart from the thousands of other UFO claims on record isn't just how strange the details are. It's the possibility, according to some researchers, that Carl was never supposed to come back at all, and that his case might be a rare surviving example of something that usually ends with a person simply gone for good. At the time, Carl was 40 years old, working as an oil driller for AM Well Service out of Riverton, Wyoming. On Friday, October 25th, 1974, he found himself with an unplanned day off, so he decided to spend it doing what he loved, elk hunting. He grabbed his brand-new 7mm Magnum rifle and pointed his truck toward McCarty Canyon, roughly 40 miles, about 64 kilometers south of his home in Rawlins. On the drive out, Carl came across 2 hunters whose pickup had died on them. He stopped to help, and while the 3 of them shared a thermos of coffee, the stranded hunters mentioned he'd probably have better luck deeper in the tree line. Carl took the advice and pushed on toward the northern edge of Medicine Bow National Forest, eventually parking on a hillside. Before heading in, he crossed paths with a game warden patrolling the area and exchanged a few words with him. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, Carl set out on foot. Less than a mile in, the trees opened into a clearing, and there they were, 5 elk, standing several hundred feet off. Something about them felt wrong before he could even say what it was. They weren't moving, not a twitch, not a flick of an ear. He lined up on the biggest bull and squeezed the trigger. What should have followed was a gunshot. Instead, nothing. Silence. And then something even harder to explain. Carl watched his own bullet leave the barrel in slow motion, drift about 50 feet through the air, strike what looked like an invisible wall, and drop straight down into the snow. The elk never so much as flinched. That's when Carl realized the entire forest had gone dead silent around him. He walked over, picked the bullet back up out of the snow, and noticed something that absolutely had not been there a minute earlier. A clear rectangular box sitting in the clearing, roughly 5 feet high, 5 feet wide, and 7 feet long, built from something that looked exactly like glass. Empty. Just sitting there. Feeling like something was standing behind him, Carl turned around and found himself staring straight at a humanoid figure hovering upright just off the ground. It wore a tight black suit that reminded him of scuba gear, stood about 6 feet 2 inches tall, and looked to weigh around 180 pounds. Its skin had a tone Carl compared to an East Asian complexion, and its face was almost human except for a few details that weren't. No chin at all, a jaw that sloped sharply back, no visible ears, no eyebrows, and narrow, slanted eyes. Its hair was stiff and straw-colored, sticking straight out in little clumps spaced about half an inch apart, almost like the bristles on a broom. Two thin, rod-like structures rose from the top of its skull, looking for all the world like antennas. It wore black shoes and a wide belt with a six-pointed star in place of a buckle, and below that sat a small apron marked with a yellow symbol. Its legs bowed noticeably outward, and instead of a right hand, a cone-shaped attachment extended from that sleeve. Carl would keep calling it him for the rest of the story. Something about it read as male to him. The figure drifted closer across the snow until it stopped just a few feet away. Without its mouth ever moving, a voice asked him, "Are you hungry?" Carl said yes. A small packet holding 4 pills floated over to him, and he was told to take one. He wasn't the type to take medication of any kind, but he swallowed it anyway, almost on autopilot. He'd later describe the feeling as being controlled into doing it. Then came a second question. Did he want to come along? "I might as well," Carl answered. He'd later explain that the choice felt like his own because he'd read UFO stories before and had privately decided years earlier that if he ever came face to face with something like this, he'd go with it. The being raised the cone-shaped device on its sleeve and pointed it at him. The next instant, Carl wasn't in the clearing anymore. He came to inside that same transparent box, except now it appeared to be sitting inside something much larger, still transparent, and apparently still somewhere in the forest. He was strapped into a bucket-style seat, his arms and head held in place by restraints. Looking up, he caught a reflection in the glass overhead and saw all 5 elk from earlier, standing frozen inside a cage. The being from the woods was there too, along with 2 others that looked almost identical to it. "You've got my elk," Carl said. One of them just shrugged. A moment later, the whole box lifted off the ground. Looking down, Carl could still make out his pickup truck sitting exactly where he'd left it, until the lead being made a small gesture with its hand, and the truck simply vanished. What came next, Carl remembered as a glowing blue sphere, and further off, an enormous marble-like shape he took to be Earth itself. The beings told him they were heading home, a world they said sat 163,000 light miles away. A helmet was fitted onto his head, 6 wires trailing off in different directions, a strap fastened under his chin. Then everything went black, followed almost immediately by a flash of light so intense it made his eyes burn and stream with tears. When his vision cleared, Carl was standing beside one of the structure's transparent outer walls. On the other side stretched an enormous open space with no walls or ceiling he could make out. A tall tower stood at its center, throwing off the light that had blinded him earlier. He compared it to Seattle's Space Needle, with lights slowly rotating near the top. At its base, he could see adults and children standing around talking, going about what looked like ordinary business. 2 of the beings, including the one from the clearing, led him along a long walkway, and this time Carl noticed his own feet weren't touching the ground either. He was floating, just like them. They stopped at a doorway that slid upward to let them through, into a large room where a panel roughly 4 feet by 8 feet dropped down in front of him, hovered a moment, then slid back up into the ceiling. One of the beings stepped forward and told him flatly, "You're not what we want. We'll take you back." He was floated back out toward that same blinding light, his eyes burning all over again. The beings explained matter-of-factly that Earth's sun affected them this way every time they visited. From there, he was brought aboard what he described as a separate craft, where he was reunited with the being from the forest, except now it gave itself a name. Auzo 1. Auzo told Carl it was a hunter, too. Its people, it said, had been coming to Earth for years to collect fish and animals, which they processed down into food pills, each one, according to Auzo, capable of feeding a member of its species for 4 full days. The reason Auzo explained was that the ocean back on its home world had turned yellow and every fish in it had died. It showed Carl a map of its planet, pointing out that part of the design matched the symbol stitched onto its apron, and mentioned that the 9 planets in its solar system together generated the magnetic force that powered its people's technology. Before sending Carl off, Auzo picked up and examined his rifle, remarking that it would have liked to keep the primitive weapon for itself, but wasn't allowed to. It also explained the all-black clothing, protection from the effects of Earth's sun. After the craft passed through what Carl called a dark void, he realized they were back above the forest. Auzo told him simply that it will see him again. Moments later, Carl found himself drifting gently back down toward the ground on his own beneath the craft. Just before his feet touched down, his boot caught a rock, and he fell, tumbling down a hillside and wrenching his shoulder in the process. He got back up, found a road, and followed it until he came across a parked pickup truck, and for a moment didn't even register that it was his own. He climbed in and heard voices crackling out of the CB radio. Once he'd worked out how to use it, he got through to someone who turned out to be his boss, Roy Fleming. Fleming asked for his name and his location. Carl couldn't manage either one. All he could say was, "I don't know, I am so cold." When pressed for any detail about where he was, the best he could offer was that he was in a pickup with a funny stick in the middle, despite having driven a manual transmission for most of his life. Fleming first heard Carl's voice on the radio around 6:30 that evening. Hours earlier, back at 4 p.m., Carl's wife Marjorie had come home from work with an unexplained, uneasy feeling and a strong pull to go find her husband. Not long after, she got word of his garbled CB call for help. Carbon County Sheriff Charles Ogburn moved fast, putting together a search team that included Deputy Sheriff Ed Tierney and 4 local hunters. Marjorie called her friend Marilyn James, and Marilyn's husband Don drove both women out to join the search. The roads were a mess of mud, slowing the sheriff's team down as they tried to reach the area where Carl's truck was believed to be. Marjorie and the others were told to wait on a nearby hilltop until they heard something. While they waited, Marilyn suddenly felt the truck shake, then pointed up at a large light moving through the sky, something that looked at first like a star, except it was changing colors. For close to 20 minutes, everyone in the truck watched it sweep a wide arc overhead, flashing from red to green to white. Just before 11:40 p.m., word came through that the search team had found Carl. His truck turned up about 3 miles from where he'd originally parked it, buried in deep mud, with no tire tracks anywhere leading in. As they waited for the search party to make it back to the forest gate, Marjorie, Marilyn, and Dawn noticed a bright red-orange glow rising in the east and assumed at first that it was sunrise. It wasn't. Actual sunrise didn't happen until hours later. The moment the search party got back, Marjorie could see something was badly wrong. Carl was disoriented, struggling to form sentences, and didn't seem to recognize her at all. When she spoke to him, he just stared. She'd later describe it as feeling like he was looking straight through her. Someone asked if he'd managed to shoot an elk. Carl looked out through the windshield and answered in an odd sing-song voice, "They took my elk. They took my elk." He was clearly freezing, so Marjorie draped her coat over his shoulders. He jerked away from her and shouted, "Don't touch me." On the drive to Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, he turned to Roy Fleming and, apparently out of nowhere, asked why Fleming wasn't dressed in black, adding, "Doesn't the sun burn you?" Carl reached the emergency room a little after 2 a.m. His eyes wouldn't stop watering, apparently irritated by the ordinary hospital lighting. His shoulder was in bad shape, and he kept asking for his pills that float to you. Doctors couldn't find a single cut, bruise, broken bone, or trace of bleeding anywhere on him. Toxicology came back clean, no drugs in his system at all. Dr. R.C. Tonko's diagnosis was amnesic shock. At one point, Marjorie asked him his own name, and Carl answered, "They keep calling me Carl. Who is Carl?" As he recovered over the following hours, fragments of the experience started coming back to him, though plenty stayed foggy. Marjorie handed him a pencil and paper and told him to write down whatever surfaced. He sketched the being he'd encountered and wrote a single word: Enders. Later, a deputy mentioned, almost in passing, that a different hunter named Enders had also been out in another part of the same forest that night. Carl also drew a fork in the road, a rough outline of the transparent craft, jotted down 2 addresses nobody could identify, and made a separate note about a truck. He was released from the hospital on the morning of Monday, October 28th. Dr. Tonko's x-rays came back completely clean, which genuinely surprised Carl. Earlier x-rays taken years before had shown scar tissue on his lungs left over from a prior bout of tuberculosis. He'd also dealt with kidney stones before the incident. After it, there was no trace of either. Even so, he spent the following days fighting headaches and back pain. When he later spoke with reporter Sue Taylor of the Daily Times in Rawlins, Carl admitted he still couldn't explain any of it and openly wondered whether he must be crazy. Taylor's article, published Tuesday, October 29th, became the first newspaper coverage of the case. Roy Fleming eventually connected Carl with a local rehabilitation counselor who suggested he reach out to Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a University of Wyoming psychologist known for studying UFO reports. On November 2nd, Sprinkle drove out to Carl's home and began the first of what would become several hypnosis sessions. Under hypnosis, more details of the encounter surfaced, and Sprinkle brought in a local art teacher to sketch Ouzo 1 based on Carl's descriptions. Sprinkle didn't stop at Carl. He interviewed Marilyn James, Sheriff Ogburn, Dr. Tonko, the nurse who'd treated Carl, members of the search party, and several other locals. Every single person who knew Carl described him the same way: honest, hard-working, not the type to make something like this up. Follow-up psychological and psychiatric testing at the university turned up no evidence of mental illness. Sometime later, Carl told Marjorie he wanted to take her and their son out for a drive. He headed a few miles south of town, turned onto a dirt road, and climbed a hill like he already knew exactly where he was going. More than 150 feet overhead, the family spotted a bright green object shaped like an upside-down ice cream cone, and at the same moment, a strong smell hit them, something like dirty socks mixed with sulfur. Carl looked suddenly upset. "I am late," he said. "I was to be here a few minutes earlier." A few nights after that, he woke Marjorie in the middle of the night and told her, "I know it is weird. I am in bed with you, yet I am out south of town. They are telling me, look for a black box." He came to believe it was their way of reminding him they could reach him whenever they wanted. Just thinking about it upset him badly enough that the pain in his shoulder came back. On plenty of drives to and from work after that, Carl said mysterious lights would trail him across the sky, and he wasn't the only one who noticed. Other people reported seeing the same thing. Both he and Marjorie also became convinced their phone line was being tapped. Carl has said that even years later, he still occasionally experiences what feels like telepathic contact with Ouzo. On one occasion, he claims he mentioned that Rawlins needed rain. The next day, 3 inches fell. The day after that, another 2. When he asked Ouzo to stop, the rain stopped. Carl has also maintained that right before he pulled the trigger that day, he'd stepped into some kind of force field that slowed his bullet down before it ever reached the elk. At one point, Carl went back to the site with Don, Marilyn, and a few others. They photographed the area and swept it with metal detectors, hoping to recover the bullet's missing lead core. They never found it. Where the transparent box had appeared, they found burned leaves scattered on the ground and several trees carved with strange weathered markings. The bullet itself ended up with Dr. Walter Walker, a metallurgy consultant for the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, who examined it and could only conclude that it had struck something hard enough to turn the metal inside out. A metallurgist at the University of Wyoming took a look at it after that, and not long afterward, the bullet vanished from the university's safe. The story didn't stay local for long. A television crew from In Search Of made the trip to Rawlins, and so did a film crew from Japan. The National Enquirer arranged for Carl to take a polygraph test, which he passed, the first of several he'd go on to pass over the years. Decades later, Marjorie felt compelled to put the full story down on paper, eventually self-publishing it in 2017 under the title Alien Abduction of the Wyoming Hunter. In 2022, investigator David Paulides featured the case in one of his documentaries covering people who vanished under circumstances nobody can fully explain. He sat down with Carl and Marjorie again and drew connections between this case and other disappearances reported in the same region. Paulides has argued that the detail of Carl being gently set back down at the end of his experience matters more than it might seem. It echoes hundreds of unusual death cases in his own files, where recovered bodies appeared to have fallen from a height. Carl's truck raised similar questions since there were no tracks leading to the muddy spot where it turned up, which led some to wonder if it too had simply been dropped there. Researcher Linda Moulton Howe has documented a comparable pattern in animal mutilation cases. Carcasses found with broken legs, no tracks nearby, and the ground beneath them oddly compressed, as if something had come straight down rather than walked in. Carl has always believed some kind of medical examination happened right after that strange shield or wall appeared in front of him inside the structure, and that he somehow failed it. His first theory was that the bright light had damaged something in his eyes. Later on, he started to wonder if the real reason was his vasectomy. There's another strange thread here, too. The lung scarring from his old tuberculosis case and the kidney stones he'd had before the encounter both seem to have disappeared afterward. Researcher Preston Dennett has collected more than 300 separate reports describing exactly this kind of unexplained healing, following encounters with UFOs or unidentified beings. Dennett's theory is that these are advanced extraterrestrials operating on some framework beyond simple good or evil, healing people for reasons that go past testing or experimentation. Almost exactly 35 years after Carl's experience, another hunter went missing in that same forest. Mark Anthony Strittmatter had hunted the area for 15 years before he disappeared on October 19, 2019. Like Carl, Mark vanished from a stretch of forest he'd never hunted before. On an earlier trip, he'd reportedly seen a black UFO trail him for some time, and like Carl and like a striking number of other missing persons cases that come up in this kind of research, Mark was of German ancestry, though unlike Carl, he had never had a vasectomy. Ufologist Jacques Vallée has pointed out something interesting buried in much older folklore. Stories about fairies, elves, and other legendary beings frequently include an offer of food. In some of those old tales, accepting it comes with a reward, like an endless supply afterward. Irish folklore takes a darker view. Eating anything from the fairy world, it warns, ties you to that world permanently, with no way back to ordinary life. There's a similar pattern in how many UFO encounters describe movement too, beings that don't walk so much as float. The entities described in the Pascagoula abduction were said to float directly out of their craft, and the so-called goblins from the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter were reported gliding just above the ground, swaying at the hips as they moved. One more small, odd detail worth mentioning: Auzo measured the distance to his home planet in light miles, not light years, a unit that doesn't really mean anything scientifically. Details like that show up across a surprising number of abduction accounts. Italian abductee Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, for instance, described giant gill-covered beings who told him they came from the third galaxy, a phrase that similarly has no real meaning in actual astronomy. Looking at everything in Carl Higdon's case together, some researchers believe he may have originally been meant to disappear for good, and that something about him simply didn't meet whatever criteria the beings were working from, so instead of vanishing, he was sent back. If that reading holds up, it raises an uncomfortable possibility that at least some of the people who've gone missing under similarly strange circumstances experienced something very close to what Carl did, except without the part where they came home. Under that interpretation, at least a portion of the unexplained disappearances David Paulides has spent years documenting might connect back to the very same phenomenon behind reported UFO abductions and other unexplained encounters with strange, unidentified beings. Fiji UFO. In October 2017, a video uploaded under the title UFO Fiji claimed to show a strange object hovering in the skies above Fiji. The footage appeared to capture a dark, disc-shaped object with bright horizontal bands wrapped around its middle, giving it a look that many viewers compared to a giant flying donut. The object seemed to remain steady in the sky while the person filming tried to keep it in view. Because of its unusual shape, some people believed it was unlike any known aircraft or weather balloon. The person who uploaded the video said they believed the object was a real UFO rather than computer-generated imagery, CGI. At the same time, they admitted there was no way to be completely certain without stronger evidence or direct observation. They also pointed out what appeared to be a much smaller object flying ahead of the larger one. According to their interpretation, the smaller object could have been some kind of scout craft accompanying a larger mothership. The uploader compared the sighting to two famous UFO cases. The first was the STS-75 Space Shuttle tether incident from 1996, in which several circular objects appeared on NASA footage and became known among UFO enthusiasts as the donut UFOs. The second was the Japan Airlines Flight 1628 encounter in 1986, where the flight crew reported seeing an enormous walnut-shaped object over Alaska. Despite these comparisons, no independent investigation has confirmed what the object actually was. Skeptics believe it may have been a balloon, an optical illusion, or another ordinary object seen from an unusual angle. More than 8 years later, the Fiji UFO remains unexplained, leaving people divided over what they saw. So, what do you think? Was this a genuine UFO caught on camera, or was it simply a misidentified object? Let us know your opinion in the comments below.